To talk to you all today. I'm going to be chatting about pathology, and please feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions or comments or heckling, whatever you want to do. Okay, I can advance slides. So just a tiny bit of background. So I did a medical doctor, did my residency training in anatomic pathology. In the US, there's like two types of pathology. There's anatomic pathology, which is the study of tissue, which is what I did. And there's also clinical pathology, which I'm not really going to talk about, that in some places also called laboratory medicine. And in anatomic pathology, there's like two main informatics trends. One is in digital pathology, so taking these glass slides that we make to diagnose mostly cancer and scanning them, and then we have a digital image we can do things with. And then there's computational pathology. That's really, taking these digital images or other digital forms of data and doing some type of computation on them. But the medical practice is both looking at images like you have here in the top right, like macroscopic image of a tumor in bone, and then looking at slides under the microscope. Then, here's an example of a breast cancer slide from the TCGA, which is a big publicly available data set of pathology images. And so pathologists might look at a slide like this at this magnification where you can see we've stained this with hematoxylin and eosin, which turns the tissue as a combination of blue and pink and purple. We might look at this magnification and see there's a lot of purple stuff here that's probably indicative of a tumor. And we'll really integrate the information at this level, this like very low magnification, all the way down to this very high magnification where you can see individual cells. And a pathologist will look at these images and integrate information from the medical record and the images and maybe some radiology images, all to come up with a final diagnosis. And I think that's like kind of the basis of how I approach computational pathology and what I did in my postdoctoral research. And what I'm doing now, starting a lab here at Emory, is figuring out how can we use computational tools and AI to make this process a bit better. And I think, probably everyone living and breathing nowadays has been touched in some way by the mainstream hype for AI. And many of you may be familiar with this interface for ChatGPT. And, pathologists and medical practice are not immune from this mainstream hype. And there's been a number of papers by pathologists about the integration of ChatGPT and other generative models that pathologists can interact with in the field of pathology. ChatGPT being by far the most popular and the most readily accessible for the mainstream audience. And I would say, most pathologists don't really have much computational experience or much know-how when it comes to AI, but there's a lot of interest, I think, reflected, in many areas of daily life now. And, part of my postdoc work was saying, can we take all of this interest and the expertise that went into developing something like ChatGPT and the fairly obvious ways that it might be used, in theory at least, to improve or add to pathology practice and build a pathology specific version of that. And that led to this paper published in Nature this year. And it just as a little video demo of what we built, we trained an AI model using a couple different techniques, added a bunch of pre-trained models and collected data and did some evaluation, all to essentially make like a version of ChatGPT or some other generative multimodal model that a pathologist could interact with text and add images and get the model to talk to you about it. And that's what I want to chat with you today. And I'll just let this video play a little bit, but suffice to say it serves like or performs some of the functions that you kind of expect from ChatGPT. We can add images and ask the model to describe what's in the image. We can also submit text queries, and the model sort of understands pathology in general through the mechanism of how we trained it, and remembers the image that you put in and previous queries like that. And the idea being that this would be like a co-pilot for a pathologist, that if you're a pathology, in pathology practice here in 2024, and you're maybe using digital pathology, maybe you have two monitors, one where you have the pathology image up on one screen and something like PathChat up on the other screen that could help you maybe practice at a higher level of pathology by reminding you of some rare tumors or educating you about molecular findings that might go on with particular tumors. Can I advance the slide? Yeah. Okay. So a little bit of the outline for the rest of the talk. I'll talk a little bit about the architecture of PathChat, talk about some data, how we train the model, and then how we evaluated and what's going on next. All right. So I think some of the novelty here for this paper was not so much as building a new architecture for something like this, but assembling different ingredients. So I kind of think of this as like a recipe for something that we built. And so we use this lava model, which is from Microsoft Research, that couples a large language model here in the top left with a vision encoder, a projector, and I guess that's it. I made it sound like there was going to be another thing, but really that's what you've got. And the whole point of this is to make a multimodal large language model that lets you submit some language instructions here, denoted XQ, and images if you want them, denoted XV, and have a large language model understand those inputs and produce some language response. Along the way, we'll prepare a tokenized language instruction, that's HQ here, that lives in the embedding space for this large language model. And the tokenization just takes our text and converts it into integers. We also will need some intermediate image representation denoted ZV that I'll talk a little bit more about soon, and some tokenized image representation. And I think when I looked at this schematic first, and maybe it's because I'm not an expert, I was very confused about why we needed some projection W and this intermediate image representation ZV. And the way I think about it is this, is that we have an image encoder here in this light blue rhombus, and we have a text encoder in this green rhombus. And when we encode the image and the text, those end up in different embedding spaces that may not be necessarily the same dimension. So we take an image, we run it through our encoder, and we get some list of floating point numbers. And for the images, we might get 1,000 of those, and for the text, we might get 2,000 of those. And what we really need is some projector that takes a point in the image embedding space and converts it to the language embedding space. And because the ultimate idea here is to add these to a large language model and produce some language output. So for this, we sort of assembled some pre-trained models here. The large language model, we used Llama 2 from Meta, an open source model, used the 13 billion parameter variant of this, and it was pre-trained just on natural language out there. So it had some understanding of English language to begin with. Our projection module, we just use this attention pooling and a two-layer, multi-layer perceptron. And for our vision encoder, we used a pre-trained model that we had previously published in Nature Medicine that you can read about, the paper with that title, that just takes our pathology image and projects it down to a smaller dimension. And then we use our projector again to go from that image embedding space to the large language models embedding space. Okay, so we've got the architecture, and the next thing we need is data. And this was, probably the bulk of the work for this project. Maybe it's true for all such computational projects. It was assembling this data and cleaning it and that sort of thing. And we really needed as much paired image and text data as possible to train our model as best as we could. And we got that image and text data from a couple different sources. One was PubMed, open access. So we scraped a whole bunch of journal articles from there that included histology images, and we had some keywords that we searched for, like histology and H&E and other pathology terms like that. We also used pathology reports from Mass General Brigham, the hospital that my postdoc lab was under. And we also got image captions from things like textbooks. And then we also took regions of interest from slides that we had scanned. So WSI stands for a whole slide image. That's like when we take a normal pathology glass slide and we scan that in and get a digital image there. And it's interesting for me as a pathologist that I kind of use some of these things to learn pathology myself. And so here's like an example from a pathology textbook, which was kind of one of my bread and butter ways of learning pathology is. And these textbooks often have like one or two images and some caption in language that tells you, the pathology trainee or the medical student, what you're supposed to see or what you're supposed to be looking for in that image. And so here's a gastrointestinal stromal tumor, and the caption here tells you what that image is supposed to evoke in your mind. And it makes sense to me that this sort of data goes into training something like PathChat to understand what pathology is. So we assembled all this image and text data both together and separately, and we created this instruction data set. And this instruction data set had a bunch of different types of instructions that we would use to train our multimodal large language model. We had free responses where you just ask a question and get some open-ended text. We had multiple choice things, text-only questions, et cetera, et cetera. I think a couple things interesting to me to point out is that we had to put in these kind of guardrails here where we didn't want our model to just respond to any question. And I think this is probably, extremely important for these public-facing things like ChatGPT. I know OpenAI doesn't want to be liable for what ChatGPT says, so they spend a ton of time creating and developing these guardrail instructions used to train the model to, in our case, say, this is the model trained for pathology, so if you give it an image of a cat, it's not going to respond to that. I think another thing of interest here for me was, one of the ways, this is a huge data set, it's like 456,000 instructions, close to 1 million question answer turns. That was way too many for any one person or even a team of 10 people or whatever to go through this painstakingly hand by hand, like line by line, and create these instructions. And so here, which kind of felt like a paradigm shift for me, was that we used other large language models to help prepare these instruction data sets. And so we used like GPT-4 to help prepare these things by giving, part of a pathology report and asking GPT-4 to come up with maybe a text-only question and answer terms, and then use that to train our own model, which really felt like a way to leverage these large language models to make our lives easier. All right. Next up, our training of this model kind of proceeded in 2 steps. In our first one, we're just going to train that multimodal projector that goes from our image embedding space to the large language models embedding space. And here, we give an image and we give the matched text, and we ask that these 2 things end up at the same point in the language model's embedding space. And over time, that trains our projector to do a good job of projecting from the image embedding space to the text embedding space. And in this part of the training portion, we're only training the projector module, and we're freezing our vision encoder to pre-train, and we're freezing our language model. Once we've got the projector trained up to a certain extent, we switch the training paradigm and we train both the projector W and the large language model together. And here we're making use of the full instruction data set. So both images and text, your multiple choice questions, your guardrails, your open-ended questions, your text-only questions, that sort of thing. And at the other side, you get a model that at least seems to understand some of pathology, which makes sense given the volume of data that was pathology specific that we trained this on. And so you can do things like give the model a histology image, give maybe a bit of clinical background, like this is a core biopsy from the lung, and ask what additional studies should we do on this, and say, this looks like an adenocarcinoma of the lung. What immunohistochemistry should we do to confirm that? And it gives some responses, and you can say, oh, this was positive, this was negative, and further refine what you want from it. You can also do things like give it a histology image and ask it to grade the tumor there, or ask for a diagnosis, or ask for it to describe the image that's present there. And I think that's all well and good, but we want to make sure that this thing actually works, and especially see, like, is this thing better or worse than other options out there? And the evaluation for this thing was really not straightforward at all. We knew that we wanted to compare to other language models, especially ChatGPT, or GPT-4V was the state of the art at the time. And that in particular was very challenging to design this evaluation around. Part of that is like the total black box that is OpenAI and GPT-4, despite the name. So we have no idea what's in their training data. So we could be, as part of this evaluation, we could be asking it questions or using data that's already in their training data, and we would have no idea. We also don't know what happens to text and image when we use the ChatGPT or GPT-4V API. I suspect that a lot of that is being used to train. I think early on in the ChatGPT mainstream explosion, I remember reading a story that I think it was Samsung engineers had gotten in trouble with Samsung by putting in proprietary Samsung data into GPT-4's API, and then that ending up publicly available. And so what we really don't want to do is take some private patient data and put that into GPT-4's API and then have that get leaked to OpenAI or anyone else. Also, GPT-4V has a lot of guardrails around medical things. And so we ran into an issue where it would often refuse to answer medical questions or pathology-specific questions that we have. Of course, if we can run the model locally on machines that live in our lab, there's a lot fewer restrictions on those models. We can give proprietary data, and we know that that's never leaking onto the internet. And I think what we would have loved to do is do something like this, is this is a screenshot from PathJojo, which creates this like data set or data bank of questions, I'll say, for pathology residents and fellows that are preparing to take their pathology board exams. And I think it would have been amazing had we been able to take a data set like this and use this directly for our training. But these question banks like this are proprietary. They don't want you to, of course, scrape all the images and text from these and use them for whatever nefarious purposes you have. And so what we ended up having to do was create an evaluation data set from scratch. And we actually made more than one. So we call this overall, this evaluation thing, PathQA Bench. And what we did was take some pathology images. We created just randomly some like clinical context for those images that we could use. For these images, we used both publicly available images from the TCGA and private images from Mass General Brigham. So the publicly available images we can use for GPT-4V. We don't care if those make it into OpenAI's training data set. But the caveat being that we don't know if OpenAI had already scraped those images from the internet and used for training. And then the private images from Mass General Brigham, we know that no one has ever seen those, but we can't use those for GPT-4V or any other like publicly available multimodal LLM. For our evaluation, we had some multiple choice questions. We felt that those would at least simulate the kind of pathology board exam questions that would be a good or compelling reason to say that our model performs well, but aren't really indicative of like clinical utility. And so we also had open-ended questions, some of which required the image and some of which just had text only, and felt that these were much more representative of like how a pathologist might use a model like this. Like a pathologist, I guess in theory, could ask a multiple choice question, say, here's an image. Is this ductal carcinoma or lobular carcinoma of the breast? But I think more often, when I think about myself as a pathologist, I'd ask some open-ended question, like describe this image, or what treatments would you recommend based on this image, or something like that. Okay. So just some like numerical things. Oh, is the answer B? It's really, I can look at this screen. Yes, that is indeed a lobular carcinoma. Congratulations, Thomas. All right. So this is just another example of the multiple choice questions. When we evaluated those, we found that PathChat, our model, did better than the competitors, thankfully. And I think, what made a lot of sense to me was that when we tested just with the image and the multiple choice questions, the models did better when we had added some additional context, which makes perfect sense to me. Pathologists never evaluate images in total isolation, except on like board exams. So the real clinical practice, I would never just look at an image and make a diagnosis. I'm always looking at the patient's medical record, seeing, am I the first pathologist to make this diagnosis for this patient? Or did they get this biopsied at an outside hospital or something and they already have a diagnosis? Do they have a history of some other tumor that might have metastasized to this location? Do they have a germline cancer predisposition syndrome that might make this more likely to be cancer versus benign, et cetera, et cetera. So all the models did better when we added that clinical context, and some made substantial gains. Of course, don't know exactly like how much we're giving away the answer for some of these clinical contexts. Some of them, I think, don't really give away the answer. Like this one is shows a dense spiculated mass that's kind of like uh, pretty likely to be some kind of cancer, but as of which cancer that is, not really sure. Okay, for the rest of PathQA bench, we found that our model PathChat did better than the competition. Um, and how the performance definitely varied by whether we added context as before and whether these were on the TCGA images or whether we used the private Mass General Brigham images. Of course, noting here that the GPT-4V model we could only test on those publicly available images. Also important to note that in our model and to our knowledge, at least both the lava 1.5 flavors that we tested, the TCGA publicly available images were never in the training data set. And so our like pre-trained image encoder that takes images and projects them to that sequence of floating point numbers didn't have TCGA images in the training data. But we have no idea about GPT-4P. Here's an example of one of these question and answer things that we use to evaluate here. And so here's a picture of an oligodendroglioma. It's a type of brain tumor. And we give some clinical context and ask some open-ended response. And we get 4 different responses here. And what we wanted to do as part of the evaluation was to get a better sense of, actually, let me take a step back. The multiple choice questions, very easy to grade. That's just, did the model get the question right or wrong? Of course, some of these models, you prompt engineer as best you can to get it to answer with a specific letter, but sometimes they answer with a letter that's not in the list, or they'll say like A, but then give the answer for part D. But in general, these multiple choice questions, very easy to evaluate if the model got it correct or not. These open-ended questions, much more difficult. And in some of them, there's like one correct answer. So in this case, we know previously that this is an oligodendroglioma. And so we can ask what the most probable diagnosis is, and it's pretty easy to see, did the model say that this is an oligodendroglioma or not? But other open-ended questions, say asking, what is the appropriate management for this patient, has some ambiguity to it. And for those questions, we assembled a panel of 7 pathologists, myself included, and we had these open-ended responses, and we generated a response from each of the models, and we had each pathologist rank and grade these in a blinded fashion. So each pathologist just saw the image and the question, and then 4 responses that were shuffled for each question. So response 1 doesn't come from the same model every time. And myself and one of the pathologists graded them for correctness, which was mostly straightforward, but sometimes difficult. And then we had all 7 pathologists rank them, and including ties for their preference about which response was better. And thankfully for us, we found that PathChat performed the best here. And so this just shows for each of the other three models, how often was PathChat ranked higher, so a win, ranked in the same position, a tie, or ranked lower as a loss. And so the more of this dark green you see, the more often PathChat won or was ranked higher for various questions. And overall, PathChat was the most accurate model. GPT-4v did pretty well itself. And this performance seemed to vary by the type of question that was asked. So PathChat really excelled when you're given an image and some text and asked for a diagnosis, or when the image required some understanding of the microscopic image. So maybe to when it was asked to describe what's in an image. PathChat also did well, but actually did second best overall when the question didn't require any understanding of, say, the image usually, or in the question stem, the model could just guess what the diagnosis was. And so there were also questions that asked, like, what's the clinical management of this patient, or, what's the best treatment for a glioblastoma type of brain tumor, or what other testing would you do, both in pathology terms and other terms. ChatGPT, or sorry, GPT-4v did extremely well on those two. These other two open source models from Microsoft Research did not do that well overall. I think one thing that was interesting looking at this chart for me was that there's a pretty big range of how between pathologists, like how their preferences about these models. So there are some pathologists that really liked PathChat, say pathologist 2 versus Lava 2, and others that really loved, in comparison, GPT-4v, which is interesting. I think some of that preference I think is based on how the model like structures their responses. Does it give a bulleted list? Does it use bold font for important words or the important phrase in a particular response, that sort of thing. And I'm very curious to investigate further, to what extent does how the response look influence a pathologist or anyone's preference for that response, regardless of what the content of the response is. All right, just talking about what's next very briefly. I think one thing that should definitely be talked about is this idea of model optimization. So GPT-4v and Claude and Gemini and all these use a bunch of techniques to make the responses better for humans. So there's reinforcement learning from human feedback is probably the biggest one. Then there's some, I guess, competitors with that, like direct preference optimization. Here, that's really hard for us. So, if we want to make this model specific for pathologists and be a co-pilot for pathologists, I think the big open-ended question is, do we need pathologists to do this human feedback? So, it's been shown over and over that these sort of things like greatly improve how good the responses of these models are. If we have to have pathologists do that feedback, then that really reduces the number of people that can do this. Pathologists are busy and they're expensive, and how would we do something like that for PathChat? I think it's really beyond the scope for academia, and maybe would require a private company to do something like that. Or maybe we don't need pathologists to do most of this. We can just use just your average person. Next up is expanding the sort of context links for these. So these models, as of now, we can only do like regions of interest for the images. So those are images up to like 1024 pixels per side, or maybe 2048. But those images are a very small fraction of what's on a glass slide. So these glass slides may be 80,000 pixels per side. So far too large of an image to put into this, and really far too large for the model to integrate information from every part of that slide as a pathologist would. And so figuring out, I think, making some fundamental changes to the architecture to allow bigger input size, not only for the images, but also for the text. It would be great if I could give the entirety of a patient's medical record and multiple pathology slides to this model and have it and ask it questions about what it thinks the diagnosis is, or what the appropriate treatment should be, or how often should this patient follow up, or something like that. But right now, we in the lab, at least, we just don't have the ability to do that, and some changes need to be made there. I think a big one is addressing hallucinations. I think hallucinations are inconvenient when you're using ChatGPT to help you write an essay, but if you're going to deploy something like PathChat for clinical use, it could be potentially deadly. And so, just as an example, I asked PathChat, I gave it this image from a glioblastoma type of brain tumor, and I asked it to count how many mitoses are in here. And so it's important to know we did not train PathChat to count mitoses or identify them in images. Mitoses, that's like a cell dividing. Like that sort of information, I'm sure, is represented in some of those journal articles or things like that we put in the training data, but it was not specifically trained to do that. PathChat says there are two mitoses in the image in the upper left corner, and I like really hunted through here, and I do not see that at all. So I think that's like completely hallucinated. And obviously, that would be a huge issue if a pathologist or someone else is, making their medical decisions based on these hallucinations. Another big one that I didn't really think about beforehand was how to keep the output of these models up to date. And so here's an example from, I think that was in that video that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. We give the model this image of a glioblastoma and asked it what genes are mutated. And so in glioblastomas, very commonly there are mutations in IDH1 and IDH2. The model calls this tumor glioblastoma multiforme, which was the name for this tumor up until 2016 when the WHO officially changed the name from glioblastoma multiforme to just glioblastoma. Of course, PathChat is trained on data that includes many things that were published before 2016, and so this term glioblastoma multiforme is all over the training data. But now we want it to only call it a glioblastoma. I think sort of baked into all of these sort of models like this is this bias towards the past. We can't train on future data. There's very little data from the present. And so how do we keep the model's output to be up to date like that? Do we need to specifically identify all instances where, for example, the terminology for a tumor has changed and include a bunch of instances of that in the training data? But how do we even do that? How do we know that something is out of date until we get an example like this? All right, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you very much for listening to me prattle away. There's again the paper, and I see some questions in the chat already. Thank you very much.